My name is Henry Mitchell. I'm 43 years old, and until 3 months ago, I was a wildlife photographer based out of Anchorage. I say was because I don't think I'll ever be able to return to that profession again. Not after what happened in the Tongass National Forest last winter. I've always considered myself a rational man, someone who believes in what he can see, touch, and document with his camera. But some things can't be explained by rational thought, and some creatures shouldn't exist in our world. I'm writing this account partly as therapy. My psychiatrist suggested it might help, but mostly as a warning. There are places in Alaska where humans simply shouldn't go, especially after dark, especially in winter. Places where ancient things still roam, things that hunger. It was late January when I received a commission from National Geographic to document the effects of climate change on the Alaskan wilderness during winter. The assignment would take me deep into the Tongass National Forest, the largest national forest in the United States. I'd been there many times before, so I wasn't concerned. In fact, I was excited. Winter photography in Alaska offers stunning contrasts and lighting you can't find anywhere else. I packed my gear, cameras, lenses, survival equipment, and enough supplies for 2 weeks in the wilderness. My plan was to hike to several remote locations, camping along the way to capture the changing landscape. My first mistake was going alone. My second was ignoring the warnings. The day before my departure, I stopped by a small general store in Petersburg, the closest town to my planned entry point into the forest. The elderly shopkeeper and Tlingit native, who introduced himself as Samuel, grew concerned when I mentioned where I was heading. "That part of the forest," he said, his weathered face growing serious, "it's not good in winter, especially not now, during Gush Yike, the dark month." I smiled politely, having heard similar superstitions before. "I've been in that area multiple times," I assured him. Samuel shook his head. "Not like this. The winter has been strange. Too warm, then too cold. The animals are behaving oddly, and there have been sightings." "Of what?" I asked, more to be polite than out of any genuine concern. "Kushtaka," he said quietly. "What you might call a land otter, man. But it's something else now. Something worse. It walks on 2 legs, then 4. It hunts at night." I thanked him for his concern and purchased my remaining supplies. As I was leaving, he pressed something into my hand, a small carved wooden amulet on a leather cord. "Wear this," he insisted, "and whatever you hear at night, whatever calls to you, do not leave your tent." I slipped the amulet into my pocket, chalking it up to local color. I wish I had taken his warning more seriously. The first 3 days of my expedition were uneventful. The weather was cold but clear, and I managed to capture some stunning photographs of ice formations and the rare winter wildlife. I set up camp each night well before dark, kept a good fire going, and slept soundly in my thermal tent. On the 4th day, I hiked deeper into the forest than I had planned. The light was perfect, and I kept pushing forward to capture just one more shot, then another. By the time I realized how far I'd gone, the short winter day was already fading. I hurried to set up camp in a small clearing beside a frozen stream, working quickly as the temperature dropped. That was the first night I heard it, a distant howl that didn't sound quite like a wolf. I'd heard plenty of wolves before, but this was different, longer, deeper, with an almost human quality to its ending. I told myself it was just the wind through the trees, or perhaps a wolf with an unusual call. I zipped up my tent and buried myself in my sleeping bag, suddenly very aware of how alone I was. I woke sometime in the darkest part of night to the sound of movement outside my tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the snow, circling my campsite. Heavy breathing. I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent. I could see a shadow against the nylon, larger than a man, much larger. I reached slowly for my flashlight and knife, my only weapons. The shadow remained motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then a sound I will never forget. A low, rumbling growl that turned into something like words. Not speech exactly, but as if something was trying to mimic human language with vocal cords never meant for such a purpose. "Henry," it seemed to say, drawing out the syllables unnaturally. I froze. How did it know my name? I hadn't told anyone in the area my destination except for the shopkeeper and the permit office. The shadow leaned closer to the tent, sniffing loudly. I clutched Samuel's amulet, which I had hung around my neck more as a curiosity than out of belief. Whether it was that or just luck, the creature eventually moved away, its footsteps receding into the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. At the first hint of dawn, I packed my gear with trembling hands and headed back the way I had come. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just a bear or a moose, and my frightened mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I made good progress that day, stopping only briefly to eat and rest. By late afternoon, I estimated I was about halfway back to my entry point. The weather was turning, though. Clouds rolled in, heavy with snow, and the temperature plummeted. I set up camp in a dense grove of spruce trees, hoping they would provide some shelter from the coming storm. The snow began falling shortly after sunset, thick flakes that quickly blanketed everything in white. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. At least I told myself it was the wind. I built a fire and kept it going as long as I could, but eventually the storm became too fierce, and I retreated to my tent. That night, the howling returned, closer this time. Not one voice, but several, calling to each other across the darkness. They seemed to surround my campsite, moving constantly, never staying in one place long enough for me to pinpoint their location. I clutched my satellite phone, but there was no signal. The storm, I assumed, though later I would wonder if it was something else. The next morning, I found tracks in the fresh snow around my tent. Some looked almost like wolf prints, but far too large, the size of dinner plates. Others were more disturbing, elongated footprints, like a man's but with long, claw-like toe marks extending from the front. They circled my tent, sometimes walking on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, judging by the pattern. I took photographs of the prints before the falling snow could erase them. Looking back at my camera now, those photos are gone, deleted or corrupted somehow. The only evidence I have left is what's seared into my memory. I broke camp quickly and continued my journey back towards civilization. The storm had dropped at least a foot of fresh snow, making progress slow and exhausting. By midday, the clouds had cleared, but a heavy mist rose from the ground, limiting visibility to a few dozen yards. Every shadow in the trees seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. That afternoon, I found the cabin. It wasn't on any of my maps, and I was certain it hadn't been there when I came through days earlier. It was old, built of dark logs with a sagging roof. In my increasingly panicked state, it seemed like shelter, somewhere more substantial than my tent to spend the night. As I approached, I noticed there were no tracks in the snow around it, no smoke from the chimney. The door creaked open at my touch, revealing a single room with basic furnishings: a bed, a table, a wood stove. Everything was covered in a layer of dust, except for a chair by the table, which looked recently used. On the table was a journal, open to a page dated just 1 week earlier. The handwriting was frantic, barely legible, but I could make out a few phrases. "They're hunting me. Not wolves, something worse. They can mimic human speech. And most chillingly, they wear their victims' faces." I should have left immediately. Every instinct told me to run, but exhaustion and cold overwhelmed my fear. I told myself the journal was left by some hunter with an overactive imagination, or perhaps a prank meant to scare hikers. I started a fire in the stove and barricaded the door and single window as best I could. As darkness fell, I huddled near the stove's warmth, my camera and satellite phone beside me, still stubbornly showing no signal. The howling began as soon as night fell completely, closer than ever. They knew where I was. I could hear them moving around the cabin, scratching at the walls, testing the door. I clutched my knife and considered my options. The cabin suddenly felt like a trap rather than a sanctuary. Then came the voices. "Henry," one called in a perfect imitation of Samuel, the shopkeeper. "Henry, I've come to help you. Please let me in." "Henry, buddy, it's Mark," called another, mimicking my best friend's voice exactly. "Open up, man. It's freezing out here." The most terrible was the third voice, my wife, Sarah. "Henry, please. They're after me. Let me in, Henry, please." I covered my ears and repeated to myself that it couldn't be them. Sarah was home in Anchorage. Mark was in Seattle. Samuel didn't even know exactly where I was. It was impossible. A tremendous crash shook the cabin as something heavy slammed against the door. The wood splintered but held. Claws raked across the window, leaving deep gouges in the frame. I backed toward the far corner, knife in hand, knowing it would be useless against whatever was out there. Then suddenly, silence fell. The attacking stopped. The voices ceased. I stood in the dark cabin, shaking, straining to hear any sound from outside. Nothing but the normal noises of the forest at night. After what felt like hours, I heard a new sound, the soft crunch of something moving through snow, heading away from the cabin. Relief washed over me. Perhaps they had given up. Perhaps dawn was approaching, and they only hunted at night. I must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion. When I jerked awake, pale daylight was filtering through the window. The cabin was freezing. The fire had gone out hours ago. I approached the window cautiously and peered outside. The clearing around the cabin was empty except for the tracks. Countless large paw prints and those disturbing half-human footprints, all leading away into the forest. I gathered my courage and my gear, determined to cover as much ground as possible in daylight. As I opened the door, I nearly tripped over what lay on the threshold. A dead deer, freshly killed, its throat torn out. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The poor creature's face had been removed, peeled off with surgical precision. A warning, a promise. I skirted around the grisly offering and set off at the fastest pace I could manage. The tracks led in the opposite direction from my route, which gave me some comfort. The day was clear, the sun bright on the snow, and with each step toward civilization, my fear began to recede. I started to rationalize what had happened. A pack of wolves, perhaps, or even bears awakened early from hibernation. The voices were my imagination, the product of fear and isolation. By late afternoon, I had covered an impressive distance, pushing myself beyond exhaustion. According to my GPS, I was less than a day's hike from the ranger station at the forest boundary. I would make it. I would survive this. I almost didn't make camp that night. I considered hiking through the darkness, but reason prevailed. The terrain was treacherous, and in the dark, I could easily break a leg or worse. I found a defensible position, a rocky outcrop that gave me a clear view of the surrounding forest, and set up my tent. I didn't bother with a fire. Part of me thought it might attract them. Another part knew it wouldn't matter. If they wanted to find me, they would. I sat at the entrance of my tent, knife in hand, watching the sun sink below the trees. The forest grew eerily quiet as darkness fell. No birds, no rustling of small animals, nothing. Just silence and the occasional moan of wind through the trees. I stared into the gathering shadows, my eyes playing tricks on me, seeing movement where there was none. Hours passed. Nothing happened. No howls, no voices, no shadowy figures circling my camp. Perhaps I had left them behind. Perhaps the amulet Samuel had given me really did offer some protection. I must have drifted off to sleep sitting up, knife still clutched in my hand. I awoke to early morning light and overwhelming relief. I had made it through the night. One more day of hiking, and I would reach safety. I packed quickly and set off, my spirits higher than they had been in days. The forest seemed almost welcoming in the morning light, the snow glittering, the air crisp and clean. I began to wonder if I would ever tell anyone about my experience. Who would believe me? Around midday, I stopped by a stream to refill my water bottles and eat a quick meal. That's when I noticed the silence had returned. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. I looked up to see dark clouds rolling in from the north. The temperature was dropping rapidly. As I hurried to pack up my things, I saw it, the first clear glimpse of what had been stalking me. It stood on the opposite bank of the stream, partially hidden among the trees. At first glance, it might have been mistaken for a man, but no man stood 7 feet tall with such an unnatural posture. It was covered in dark, matted fur, its limbs too long, its back hunched as if it wasn't accustomed to standing upright. Its face was what haunted me most. Not quite wolf, not quite human, but a grotesque combination of both. Its eyes, though, its eyes were disturbingly intelligent, watching me with malevolent awareness. Our gazes locked for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and spoke. "Run, Henry," it said in that horrible, guttural approximation of human speech. "We like it when you run." I ran. Blind panic overtook me as I fled through the forest, no longer caring about direction, only about putting distance between myself and that monstrosity. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me, but fear gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I don't know how long I ran before I realized I was being herded. Whenever I tried to turn east toward the ranger station, howls would erupt from that direction, forcing me to change course. They were all around me, driving me north, deeper into the wilderness. As daylight began to fade, I found myself in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. The trees here were older, massive trunks stretching up into the gloom. Stone formations jutted from the ground at odd angles, some carved with symbols that looked ancient and malign. I had no choice but to make my final stand. I selected the largest of the stone formations, a rough circle of standing stones, and climbed to the top of the central monolith. From this vantage point, I could see in all directions. I had my knife, my flashlight, and Samuel's amulet. It would have to be enough. Darkness fell with unnatural swiftness. The howling began, but this time with a different quality. Triumphant, celebratory. They had me exactly where they wanted me. They emerged from the trees one by one, loping on all fours until they reached the edge of the stone circle. There were 5 of them, each slightly different in appearance, but sharing the same general form, that nightmarish blend of wolf and human. They surrounded the stone formation, pacing back and forth, but not approaching further. The largest of them, the one I had seen by the stream, rose to its full height and stepped forward. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see details I had missed before. The patchwork quality of its fur, as if pieces had been added over time. The necklace of teeth and small bones around its neck. And most disturbingly, what looked like a human face stretched and incomplete, partially merged with its snout. "Henry Mitchell," it growled, my full name twisted in its inhuman mouth. "Photographer, husband, trespasser. What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. "To hunt," it replied simply. "To feed. To become." "I don't understand," I said, though part of me was beginning to grasp the horrible truth. "We are Kushtaka no longer," it said. "We are becoming something new. With each hunt, with each face we take, we learn, we change, we become more like our prey." The implications were too terrible to contemplate. These creatures weren't just killing, they were absorbing, taking on characteristics of their victims. How long had this been happening? How many hikers, hunters, and travelers had disappeared in these woods over the years, their identities consumed by these monsters? "The old man gave you protection," it continued, gesturing to the amulet around my neck. "But its power wanes with the moon's rising. When it reaches its peak, we will come for you, for your face, for your knowledge." As if on cue, the clouds parted, revealing a nearly full moon climbing in the sky. I looked down at the amulet and saw that the carvings on it were fading, the wood turning gray and lifeless. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't fight them all. I couldn't escape. As the moonlight grew stronger, the creatures became more agitated, circling closer to the stones, their movements more frenzied. Then I remembered my camera. In my panic, I had forgotten I was still wearing it around my neck. A desperate idea formed. These creatures lived in darkness and shadow, hidden from the modern world. What would happen if I exposed them to light, not just my flashlight, but the powerful flash of my professional camera? It was a slim hope, but it was all I had. I raised my camera, aimed at the leader, and pressed the shutter release. The flash blazed like lightning in the darkness. The effect was immediate and shocking. The creature recoiled with a howl of pain, its skin actually smoking where the light had touched it. The others backed away, growling in confusion and anger. I kept shooting, each flash driving them further back. My camera battery wouldn't last forever, but it was buying me time. As they retreated to the edge of the trees, I saw my chance. Between 2 of the standing stones was a gap that now stood clear. Beyond it, I could see the trail heading east. With one final barrage of flashes to disorient them, I leaped from the stone and ran for the gap. Howls of rage erupted behind me as they realized what I was doing. I could hear them pursuing, their heavy footfalls gaining on me quickly. The moonlight saved me. It was bright enough to illuminate the trail, allowing me to run at full speed without tripping. I ran as I had never run before, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant a fate worse than death. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, it seemed. The howls eventually faded, though whether they had given up or were simply stalking me more quietly, I couldn't tell. When I finally saw lights ahead, the ranger station, I nearly collapsed with relief. I burst through the door, startling the two rangers on duty. I must have looked like a madman, covered in scratches, wild-eyed with terror. I babbled my story, showing them the photos on my camera as proof. But the photos showed nothing. Where I had captured clear images of those creatures, there were only blurry shadows or corrupted files. The rangers exchanged concerned looks, clearly thinking I was suffering from exposure or hallucinations. They were kind enough, giving me food, medical attention, and a place to sleep until a helicopter could take me back to Anchorage the next day. They attributed my experience to a combination of isolation, harsh conditions, and possibly an encounter with ordinary wolves. I knew better. And as the helicopter lifted off the next morning, I looked down at the vast expanse of the Tongass National Forest. In the daylight, it seemed peaceful, beautiful even, but I knew what lurked within its depths. Back in Anchorage, doctors found no physical explanation for my experience. My wife was concerned enough to insist I see a psychiatrist, who diagnosed me with acute stress disorder and possibly brief psychosis brought on by isolation and environmental extremes. I let them believe that. It was easier than insisting on the truth. I sold my photography equipment, ended my contract with National Geographic with a vague explanation about health issues, and moved us to Arizona. Somewhere with no forests, no shadows for creatures to hide in. But I know they're real. Sometimes on winter nights when the moon is full, I wake to the sound of howling in the distance. Not coyotes, not ordinary wolves. Something else. Something that knows my name. And sometimes when I check the locks on our doors and windows, I catch a glimpse of movement in our yard. A shadow that stands upright for a moment before dropping to all fours and slinking away. They're patient. They can wait. And someday, I fear, they'll find me again. I still have Samuel's amulet, though it never regained the power it seemed to have in the forest. I've researched the symbols carved into it and found similar designs in Tlingit protective charms meant to ward off Kushtaka, the land otter men of their legends. But what I encountered was something worse, something evolving beyond those ancient myths. If you ever find yourself in the wilds of Alaska, especially the old forests where the shadows seem darker than they should be, remember my warning. Don't travel alone. Don't travel at night. And if you hear something calling your name in a voice that sounds almost, but not quite, human, run. Run, and don't look back, because they're out there, watching, waiting, becoming.